The horrifying life of male concubines in ancient China. In the long sweep of Chinese imperial history, stretching from the first unification under Qin Shi Huang in 221 BCE to the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, the institution of concubinage is well known. The imperial harems, vast, labyrinthine cities of women sequestered for the pleasure and political propagation of the Son of Heaven, have been documented, romanticized, and mythologized for centuries. Yet there exists a parallel history, less discussed, often deliberately obscured by later Confucian moralists, yet persistent across dynasties: the history of male favorites, sometimes called nanchong, male favorites, or, in more clinical terms, male concubines. These were men, sometimes boys, who occupied a liminal space in the rigid hierarchy of imperial and aristocratic China. They were neither fully recognized as formal concubines within the legal structures that governed female consorts, nor were they merely servants. They existed in a zone of profound ambiguity, their status deriving entirely from the personal desire of a ruler, a prince, or a powerful aristocrat. Their lives were studies in precarity. They could rise from obscurity to wield power rivaling the most seasoned ministers, and just as quickly fall into disgrace, exile, or death. To understand the horrifying dimensions of their existence, and there was horror woven into the very fabric of their privilege, one must first strip away modern assumptions about sexuality, power, and agency. This was not a world of liberated sexual expression or romantic equality. It was a world where the body of the favorite was a political chess piece, where desire was indistinguishable from domination, and where the line between favored consort and executed scapegoat was perilously thin. The classical foundations, the warring states and the Han dynasty. The phenomenon of male favoritism in ancient China has roots that predate the imperial unification. During the Warring States period 475 to 221 BCE, when 7 contending states vied for supremacy, the courts of kings and dukes were often sites of intense political maneuvering. In this milieu, the practice of keeping handsome young men as companions, sometimes sexual, sometimes purely aesthetic, became associated with the highest echelons of power. It is from this period that the most famous archetype of the male favorite emerges, Lord Longyang Jun. According to the strategies of the Warring States Zhong Guosi, Lord Longyang was a favorite of King Anshi of Wei. In the anecdote that cemented his place in Chinese cultural memory, Lord Longyang accompanied the king on a fishing expedition. After catching several fish, he began to weep. When the king asked why, he explained, when he caught a fish, he wanted to throw it away to make room for a bigger one. His own beauty, he feared, would fade, and the king would find a younger, more beautiful favorite to replace him. The king, moved by this display of vulnerability, issued a decree: anyone who dared to recommend another beautiful man to the king would have his entire family executed. This story became the etymological root of the term Longyang Jipai, meaning the passion of Longyang, a classical euphemism for male same-sex desire. But read closely, the story reveals the underlying terror of the favorite's position. Lord Longyang's tears were not merely coquettish manipulation, they were a genuine expression of existential dread. His entire status, his security, his very life depended entirely on the king's whim. He had no family connections to protect him, no bureaucratic office with independent authority, no sons to carry on his lineage. He was an island of beauty in a sea of power, and he knew with chilling clarity that his island could be submerged at any moment. The Han Dynasty 206 BC, 220 CE elevated this pattern to new heights or depths. The early Han emperors, particularly Gaozu the founder and his descendants, were known to keep male favorites alongside their female consorts. The historian Sima Qian, in his monumental records of the Grand Historian Shiji, devoted a chapter to the favored and vile Ningxing Liezhuan, which explicitly discusses the phenomenon. Sima Qian, writing with a mixture of moral judgment and historical honesty, noted that rulers throughout history had been susceptible to those who pleased their eyes and ears. The most notorious case from the Han was that of Dong Xian, a young man who became the favorite of Emperor Arya 7-1 BCE. Their relationship is perhaps the most extreme example of imperial male favoritism in all of Chinese history. Dong Xian began as a minor palace attendant, promoted due to his remarkable beauty. Within a few years, he had become so central to the emperor's life that he was given titles of supreme military and civil authority. He was appointed Grand Marshal, the highest official rank. The emperor showered him with wealth, built him a palace rivaling the imperial residence, and even gave him the unprecedented honor of being buried in an imperial tomb, a privilege normally reserved for the emperor's own family. The famous story told of Emperor Ari and Dong Xian involves a moment of intimacy that became legendary. One afternoon, they were napping together. When the emperor needed to rise, Dong Xian's head was resting on the emperor's sleeve. Rather than wake his favorite, Emperor Ai cut off his own sleeve and slipped away. This act, known as duan xiu, cutting the sleeve, became another classical euphemism for male same-sex relations. Yet the horror of Dong Xian's position becomes apparent when one considers what happened after Emperor Ai's sudden death. The emperor was only 25 when he died, and Dong Xian's meteoric rise had created bitter enemies among the powerful Wang clan, the family of the Empress Dowager. Within days of the emperor's death, Dong Xian was stripped of his titles. His property was confiscated. Realizing that he faced certain execution, and likely the annihilation of his entire family, he and his wife chose suicide. He was 22 years old. The trajectory of Dong Xian's life encapsulates the terrifying logic of the male favorite's existence. He had reached heights of power that most nobles could only dream of. He had been given wealth, titles, and the personal devotion of the most powerful man in the world. And yet, the moment his patron died, he had absolutely nothing: no political base, no independent power, no institutional role that could protect him. He was a creature of imperial desire. And when that desire was extinguished by death, the creature was swept away. The structures of ambiguity, status, law, and the absence of institution. To understand why the lives of male favorites were so precarious, one must understand what they were not. They were not part of the formal concubinage system that structured the imperial harem. That system, which developed over centuries into an elaborate bureaucratic apparatus, had clear ranks, hierarchies, and protections. Female concubines, particularly those who bore children, could achieve lasting status. Their families could rise through their connections. They had institutional recognition. Male favorites had none of this. There was no official rank for male consort. There was no bureaucratic office that regulated their numbers or status. They existed entirely in the interstices of the system, their power deriving solely from personal intimacy with the ruler. This meant that while they could be given official titles, as Dong Xian was, those titles were always superimposed upon a status that had no formal basis. They were, in a sense, ghosts in the machinery of state, exercising power without any legitimate claim to it. This ambiguity made them uniquely vulnerable. A female empress or high-ranking consort, even if she fell from favor, could often rely on her family connections, her children, or her institutional rank to provide some measure of protection. A male favorite had none of these. His family, if he came from humble origins, as most did, could not protect him. He had no children, with the emperor biologically impossible, though some favorites adopted heirs. He had no institutional rank that could not be stripped away in an instant. The historian Sima Qian, writing in the 1st century BCE, was keenly aware of this dynamic. In his chapter on the favorites, he lists a series of men who rose through imperial favor, from Deng Tong in the early Han to the eunuchs and actors of later periods, and each story follows a similar arc: beauty, favor, power, and then catastrophe. Sima Qian's moral judgment is clear. These men were vile because they gained power through improper means. But his historical judgment is more nuanced. He recognized that the fault lay not only with the favorites themselves but with rulers who allowed personal desire to corrupt the proper functioning of the state. Yet there is a deeper tragedy in Sima Qian's account. He himself had suffered a terrible punishment, castration, for speaking truth to power. He knew intimately what it meant to have one's body and status subject to the arbitrary will of the emperor. His account of the favorites is thus not merely moral condemnation but also a kind of horrified recognition of their vulnerability. The body as currency, beauty, youth, and the inevitable decline. One of the most terrifying aspects of the male favorite's existence was the absolute centrality of physical beauty. These men were chosen for their appearance, their youth, their smooth skin, their graceful movements, their refined features. They were, in the most literal sense, objects of aesthetic appreciation. And like all objects of beauty, they were subject to decay. The classical texts are unsparing in their emphasis on beauty as the prerequisite for favor. The Shuji describes the favorites as handsome and charming young men. The Han Shu Book of Han notes that Dongxian was handsome and beautiful. This emphasis on physical appearance meant that the favorite's position was inherently temporary. Aging, illness, injury, or simply the emergence of a younger rival could destroy his status overnight. Lord Longyang's tears over the fish were not merely theatrical. They reflected a profound awareness that his position depended on a youth and beauty that could not last. Every day he grew older. Every day, somewhere in the kingdom, there was a young man whose beauty might eclipse his own. He could not fight this, could not change it, could not secure his position through any means other than the king's continued affection. This dynamic created a kind of desperate precarity that must have colored every moment of the favorite's existence. Some, like Lord Longyang, attempted to secure themselves through emotional manipulation, extracting promises and decrees. Others sought to translate their personal favor into political power, building networks of allies who might protect them when their beauty faded. But these strategies were always fragile. Political alliances built on the favor of a patron were worthless once the patron's desire shifted. The horror of this situation was compounded by the fact that many favorites were taken into service at a very young age. The sources do not always specify ages, but the language of youth and beauty suggests that some were adolescents or even younger. For these boys, the experience of being selected as a favorite would have meant a sudden and violent entry into a world of adult sexuality, political intrigue, and existential danger. They would have been removed from their families, placed in the alien environment of the palace, and made to serve the desires of the most powerful man in the world, all before they had any chance to develop an independent identity or understanding of the world. The Southern dynasties and the cult of aesthetic refinement. During the period of division known as the Southern dynasties 420 to 589 CE, when Chinese civilization was centered in the south after the fall of the Han, the phenomenon of male favoritism took on new dimensions. The aristocratic culture of the southern courts placed a high value on aesthetic refinement, poetry, and personal beauty. In this milieu, male favorites were often celebrated not merely as objects of desire but as embodiments of cultivated elegance. The Shishu or Sinew, a new account of tales of the world, a collection of anecdotes about the elite culture of this period, contains numerous references to beautiful men and the admiration they inspired. The line between appreciation of male beauty and sexual desire was often blurred. Men were described with language normally reserved for women. Their skin was like jade, their features like flowers, their bodies slender and graceful. This cultural context allowed for a certain visibility of male-male relationships that would later become impossible under more orthodox Confucian regimes. But the underlying precarity of the favorite's position remained unchanged. The southern courts were rife with political instability, with dynasties rising and falling in rapid succession. The favorites of one ruler were often purged by his successor. The aesthetic appreciation that elevated them did nothing to protect them when political winds shifted. The case of Han Zhigao from the Chen dynasty 557 to 589 illustrates this pattern. Han Zhigao was a favorite of Emperor Wu of Chen. According to the history of the Chen dynasty, Han was a young man of exceptional beauty who served the emperor with such devotion that he was given military commands and high office. After the emperor's death, Han attempted to maintain his position but became entangled in succession struggles and was eventually executed. What is striking about Han Zhigao's story is how closely it follows the pattern established by Dongxian 6 centuries earlier: rise through beauty, elevation to high office, entanglement in politics, and death after the patron's demise. The continuity of this pattern across centuries suggests that it was not merely a matter of individual circumstances but was built into the very structure of the male favorite's position. The Tang dynasty, high empire and hidden practices. The Tang dynasty 618 to 907 CE is often celebrated as a high point of Chinese civilization, a cosmopolitan empire with a relatively open culture, where women held unusual power, the reign of Empress Wu Zetian being the most notable example, and where foreign influences flowed freely along the Silk Road. In this context, one might expect male favoritism to have flourished openly. The historical record is more ambiguous. The Tang imperial house had strong Central Asian influences, and the culture of the court was less rigidly Confucian than in later dynasties. There are scattered references to male favorites, particularly among the early Tang emperors, but the sources are often oblique or deliberately vague. The most famous case is that of Emperor Xuanzong 712 to 756, whose legendary obsession with his female consort Yang Guifei overshadowed any male favorites. However, the Tang period saw the rise of a related phenomenon that would have profound implications: the increasing power of eunuchs. Eunuchs, castrated men who served in the imperial palace, occupied a position that was in some ways parallel to that of male favorites, and in some ways overlapping. Like favorites, eunuchs derived their power from personal access to the emperor. Like favorites, They were often despised by the scholar official class as corrupting influences. But unlike favorites, eunuchs had an institutional role. They were part of the palace bureaucracy, and by the late Tang, they had accumulated enormous power, controlling the imperial guards, appointing officials, and even deposing emperors. The relationship between eunuchs and male favorites is complex. Some eunuchs were undoubtedly also sexual companions to emperors. The castration that made them eunuchs also, in the eyes of some, made them safe as intimate attendants. They could not produce heirs who might threaten the imperial succession. But many male favorites were not eunuchs. Dongxian, Lord Longyang, and Han Zhigao were all intact men, and their ability to father children was itself a potential source of danger. An emperor's favorite who produced a son might attempt to place that son on the throne, a nightmare scenario for the imperial clan. The Tang dynasty thus represents a transitional period in which the informal institution of male favoritism coexisted with the growing formalization of eunuch power. By the end of the Tang, the great age of the male favorite, when a beautiful young man could rise to supreme power through imperial desire alone, was fading. But the underlying dynamics of precarity, vulnerability, and existential danger remained very much alive. The Ming and Qing: secrecy, condemnation, and persistence. By the Ming dynasty 1368 to 1644, the Confucian orthodoxy that had been developing for a millennium had become the official ideology of the state. Neo-Confucian philosophy emphasized the proper ordering of social relationships, including the strict hierarchy of gender and sexuality. Male same-sex relations were officially condemned, though the extent to which this condemnation translated into actual prosecution varied. In this context, male favoritism did not disappear but went underground. The Ming emperors, particularly the later ones, were notorious for their reclusiveness and their reliance on eunuchs. The imperial palace became a sealed world, and what happened within its walls was largely invisible to the outside. There are persistent rumors and scattered references suggesting that some Ming emperors kept male favorites, but the evidence is often indirect. The Qing dynasty 1644 to 1912, the last imperial dynasty, brought a new ruling house from Manchuria with its own cultural traditions. The Manchu emperors were generally more circumspect about their personal lives than their Ming predecessors, and the official record is even more sanitized. Yet even in this period, the phenomenon persisted, often in connection with the theater. Opera actors in the Qing period occupied a liminal social position. They were admired for their artistry and beauty but were considered socially low, legally classified as part of the mean jian class. Many male actors, particularly those who specialized in female roles were also sexual companions to wealthy patrons, including nobles and imperial princes. These relationships, known as the custom of the pear garden, were an open secret in Qing society. The experience of these actor favorites mirrored in many ways that of their ancient predecessors. They were selected for beauty and skill. They depended entirely on the favor of wealthy patrons. They were vulnerable to violence, exploitation, and abandonment. And when their youth and beauty faded, they were often discarded. One of the most chilling documents from this period is a legal case from the 18th century involving a young actor who was murdered by his patron. The records show that the patron, a minor noble, had become obsessed with the actor and had spent vast sums to keep him. When the actor attempted to leave, the patron beat him to death. The case caused a scandal, but the patron received only a light punishment, a reflection of the legal system's view that the lives of actors and favorites mattered less than those of proper social status. The psychological dimensions: power, dependency, and the erosion of self. Beyond the political and social vulnerabilities, there was a deeper horror to the male favorite's existence, a horror that was psychological and existential. To be a favorite was to be utterly dependent on the will of another. This dependency did not merely constrain one's actions, it shaped one's very sense of self. The classical sources occasionally offer glimpses of this psychological dimension. Lord Longyang's Tears of Fear. Dongxian's willingness to accept titles and honors that he must have known were unsustainable. The actor favorites of the Qing who performed beauty and grace even as they knew their days were numbered. These glimpses suggest a life lived in constant awareness of vulnerability. Consider what it would mean to know that your existence, your safety, your status, your family's well-being, depended entirely on your ability to please one person. Every gesture, every word, every expression would be calibrated to maintain that person's favor. You would learn to suppress any emotion, any desire, any thought that might displease. You would become, in a sense, a mirror for the patron's desires, reflecting back what he wanted to see. This erasure of self was compounded by the fact that favorites were often taken from their families at young ages. They were removed from the relationships and contexts that might have provided a foundation for identity. The palace or the noble household became their entire world. They had no independent existence, no life outside the patron's orbit. The horror of this situation was not lost on contemporary observers. Confucian moralists condemned male favoritism not only for its sexual impropriety but also for its political dangers. When a ruler became obsessed with a favorite, they argued he neglected his duties. The favorite's influence corrupted the administration and led to bad governance. But embedded within these moral condemnations was often a recognition of the favorite's tragic position. The favorite was not merely a corrupting influence but also a victim, a person whose very humanity was compromised by his role. The fate of the favorites: exile, death, and erasure. The ultimate horror of the male favorite's existence lay in its ending. The trajectories we have traced: Lord Longyang, who may or may not have survived his king, Dongxian's suicide, Han Zigao execution, the Qing actor murdered by his patron, all lead to violent ends or historical disappearance. Even those favorites who managed to survive the death of their patron rarely escaped unscathed. They might be exiled, stripped of their property, or forced into obscurity. But there was another form of erasure that followed: historical erasure. The official histories, written by Confucian scholar officials who viewed male favoritism as a moral failing, often minimized or omitted references to it. The same Sima Qian who documented Dongxian's rise and fall was careful to frame his account as a moral warning. Later historians were even more circumspect. The result is a historical record that is fragmentary, oblique, and often frustratingly silent. This erasure was not merely a matter of prudishness. It was a form of control. By erasing the male favorites from history, the Confucian establishment sought to deny the legitimacy of the relationships that had elevated them. The message was clear: these men existed, they wielded power, but they should not have existed, and we will act as if they did not. For the favorites themselves, this posthumous erasure must have been a kind of final horror. They had given everything: their bodies, their youth, their autonomy, for a position that history would either condemn or ignore. Their names might survive as cautionary tales or as euphemisms for deviance, the passion of long yang, cutting the sleeve, but their humanity was lost. To speak of the horrifying life of male concubines in ancient China is not to deny that some of these individuals experienced moments of genuine intimacy, perhaps even affection, with their patrons. The story of Emperor Ai cutting his sleeve rather than waking Dongxian suggests a tenderness that transcends mere exploitation. But tenderness does not negate structural vulnerability. The emperor who cuts his sleeve is the same emperor whose death leaves his favorite defenseless. The horror of the male favorite's existence lay not in any single event but in the structure of his life. He occupied a position of supreme privilege and absolute powerlessness simultaneously. He was elevated above nobles and ministers but had no claim to his elevation other than the whims of desire. He was given wealth and titles but could not pass them to his children. He was celebrated for his beauty but knew that beauty would fade. He was the object of the most powerful man in the world's desire but could not, in the end, protect himself from that same man's death or changing affections. This structure was not accidental. It was built into the political logic of imperial China, where all power flowed from the emperor and could be given or withdrawn at will. The male favorite was merely the most extreme embodiment of a system in which no one, not the highest minister, not the empress herself, had power that was truly independent of the ruler's will. But the favorite's position was unique in its naked dependence, stripped of the mediating institutions, family, office, bureaucratic rank, that provided some protection to others. In the end, the story of the male concubines of ancient China is not merely a story about sexuality. It is a story about power in its purest form, power without accountability, power without limit, power that could elevate a man to the heavens one day and destroy him the next. It is a story about what happens when human beings become objects of desire in a system that recognizes no inherent dignity or rights. And it is a story that, despite the erasures of the historical record, demands to be told, not for sensationalism, but for the light it sheds on the darkest corners of human society. This essay draws on a range of primary sources, including Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian Shiji, the Book of Han Shu, the strategies of the Warring States Zhongguo Si, the history of the Chen dynasty Chen Shu, and a new account of tales of the world Shishio Xinyu, as well as secondary scholarship on gender, sexuality, and power in imperial China.